In the frozen heart of a frontier winter, an 11-year-old settler boy stepped outside his cabin and saw what looked like a heap of rags by the fence. It wasn't. It was a dying native girl, barely breathing in the snow. Helping her meant defying his father, breaking every rule of survival, and risking war with the tribes beyond the ridge. But he did it anyway. Wrapped her in his late mother's quilt and prayed she'd live. What he didn't know was, she was the daughter of a powerful war chief, and by sunrise, 700 warriors would be waiting at his fence. Before we dive in, tell us in comment where in the world you are watching from. The wind came first, thin and sharp as a blade, skimming across the frozen prairie and rattling the loose boards of the Dunn cabin. Caleb stepped outside clutching his mother's old quilt around his shoulders, the dawn pale and pink over the endless snow. Frost burned his breath white. He was only going to check the chicken coop, nothing more, but halfway to the fence he stopped. Something lay there in the drift, small, still, half-buried like a forgotten sack. He took one step closer, then another, his boots crunching. The shape wasn't a sack. It was a girl. Her skin was gray-blue, her lips cracked, a braid stiff with ice against her cheek. She couldn't have been much older than he was. The blanket slipped from his shoulders as he knelt beside her, pulse hammering, torn between fear and something deeper that felt like shame. The rooster crowed behind him, breaking the silence. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or why she was alone in the cold, but his hand moved on its own, brushing the snow from her face. Her eyelids fluttered once, barely. The wind hissed through the fence rails like a warning, but Caleb ignored it. Somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen eyes watched the smoke from his chimney rise into the dawn, and the boy's single act of mercy began to echo farther than he could ever imagine. The storm rolled in hard the night before, dragging a wall of white across the plains and slamming it against the cabin with the fury of a war drum. Caleb sat by the window, lantern low, listening to the hiss of snow piling against the glass and the low creak of timber groaning in the cold. His father, Ezra Dunn, a wiry man with a scarred cheek and a scout's 1,000-yard stare, had bolted the door after sundown. "We're too close to the boundary," he'd warned. "No good comes from opening to strangers in a storm, not out here." But sometime past midnight, Caleb heard it. A sound carried between gusts, a broken sob, or maybe a voice swallowed by wind. He slipped from bed, bare feet quiet on the floor, and took the quilt his mother had made before she died, faded flannel squares, stitched in rings like sunrise over wheat fields. Outside, the cold cut him to the bone, but he saw her, a shape crumpled near the fence, one arm shielding her face, motionless in the snow. She didn't flinch when he touched her. Ezra's face turned to stone when Caleb dragged her inside. "We're not a hospital," he growled. "You don't bring ghosts into this house." But Caleb shook his head and kept going. He laid the girl by the fire, peeled off her soaked buckskin coat, and wrapped her in the quilt. Her fingers were stiff, lips blue. Caleb sat beside her through the night, whispering stories about sunflowers, pie, and thunderbirds, his voice soft as the snow outside. Just before dawn, she stirred. Her eyes blinked open, dark, confused, alive. And the quilt held her like a promise. By morning, the color had returned to the girl's face, faint rose blooming beneath her cheekbones, but her lips trembled when she tried to speak, and no sound came. Caleb knelt beside her with a tin mug of broth, eyes full of wonder. She wore a leather pendant at her throat, cracked but carved with careful lines, circles within circles, like ripples in water. "Star," he whispered, pointing at the shape. "I'll call you Star, till you tell me your real name." She blinked once, slow and solemn, and didn't resist when he wrapped her tighter in the quilt. Ezra stood back from the hearth, arms crossed, jaw locked tight. "You named her?" he asked, not unkindly, but not gently either. Caleb nodded. Ezra sighed through his nose and stepped outside. That's when he saw the tracks, deep prints heading toward the ridge, barely dusted over. More than one set. Whoever, or whatever, she'd run from wasn't far behind. By midday, Ezra spotted riders through the spyglass. Dark silhouettes on the crest, unmoving but watching. He didn't need colors or feathers to know they weren't friendly. Caleb begged him not to turn her out. "She ain't done anything but be cold and scared." Ezra didn't answer. He simply looked at the sky and then at the girl. Before sundown, they moved her to the root cellar, blankets, lamp, canteen. Star didn't protest. She met Caleb's eyes with a kind of trust that carried no words. That night, with the windows shuttered and rifles laid on the table, the family listened as distant drums whispered across the snow like a heartbeat coming closer. Ezra sat with his old Sharps rifle across his knees, staring at the door. Caleb didn't sleep. He stayed near the trapdoor, hand resting on the latch, while Star slept below. Out on the prairie, the firelight flickered atop the ridge, and every flicker felt like a question the wind kept asking. What does a man risk to do what's right? Smoke curled low on the horizon when Ezra Dunn stepped outside at first light, the air still and sharp enough to slice. Not chimney smoke, this was darker, acrid, rising in thick pillars from the northwest. The trading post, 2 miles out. He didn't need to saddle a horse to know it was gone. Inside the cabin, Caleb was spooning warm oats into the girl's mouth. Her strength was returning in slivers. She looked up as Ezra entered, lips parting as though the weight of silence itself had grown too heavy. Her voice came cracked and raw. Horseman, ambush, wrong trail. Ezra's spine stiffened. She wasn't running from settlers. She'd been ambushed, cut off from her own. His gaze dropped to the pendant at her throat. He stepped forward slowly, eyes narrowing, reaching out. She didn't flinch. He turned the leather disc over in his calloused fingers and saw it. A spiral carved into a sunburst. His breath caught. "Where did you get this?" he asked, though he already knew. The memory came rushing back. 5 years earlier, a standoff near Devil's Hollow. He and 3 scouts had cornered a war party but let them go after a bloodless parley. The chief, older than the rest, wore this same symbol on his belt. Ezra hadn't known his name then, only the weight of his eyes and the grace of his mercy. Now it was clear. This girl, Star, was his daughter. He stepped back, mind racing. "If we stay, we risk a warband tearing through our home," he said aloud, more to himself than Caleb. "If we run, we look guilty. But if we ride out, we might not come back." Caleb stood beside the girl, jaw set. "We can't just let her go." "I didn't say we would." "Then what are we waiting for?" Ezra looked at his son, too young to carry so much, and yet already older than he'd been at that age. He stared at the fire for a long moment, then back at the girl, and finally at the old war medal tucked inside his coat. Choices made long ago echoed louder now. "I could ride with her," Ezra murmured. "Try to reach the tribal lands, explain." "Will they listen?" Ezra looked again at the pendant. "They might. If they remember." He met Caleb's eyes. "What would you do?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "I think we already chose." Ezra let out a breath that sounded like surrender and steel all at once. He nodded. "Then we ride at first light." The ridge stood high above the valley floor, wind sweeping over its edge like the breath of something ancient. Just before dawn, Ezra struck flint to kindling, and flames rose in a tight, clean column, tall enough to be seen for miles. Caleb stood beside him, holding the reins of their only horse. Star sat astride it, the pendant at her throat catching firelight as the sky began to pale. They waited in silence. Then came the sound, low at first, like distant thunder, then stronger, nearer. Hoofbeats. Dozens. Then hundreds. Ezra pulled Caleb gently behind him. The line of riders broke the horizon as the sun crested it. A single figure in full paint, eagle feathers catching the wind, riding alone at first. Then came the others, 20, 50, more, until the ridge below shimmered with the breath of 700 mounted warriors, silent and still. The lead rider halted 10 paces away. The girl slid from the saddle and ran to him. He dismounted with a grunt, kneeling to meet her, hands on her face, forehead against hers. No words passed between them, none were needed. Ezra reached slowly into his coat and placed the pendant in Star's small hand. She looked at Caleb once, then ran back to her father. A long pause followed, thick with the weight of old blood and broken lines. Then the war chief dismounted again, not with flourish, but with the slow certainty of a man who bore memory like armor. He approached Caleb, eyes unreadable. The warriors did not move. He stopped before the boy and removed something from his wrist, a carved bone clasp, smoothed by time and wear. "You saved my blood," he said in low, measured English. "You are now of my blood." He placed the clasp in Caleb's hand and closed the boy's fingers around it. From the ridgeline behind them, settlers who had come armed, rifles half raised, now watched in stunned silence. One by one, barrels lowered. Honor had answered mercy, and vengeance, for once, had no place. The cottonwood's leaves shimmered in the breeze, casting dappled light over the ridge where it had all begun. Caleb sat cross-legged in the grass, a year older, sun-browned and thoughtful, as Star knelt beside him, teaching him her words one syllable at a time. Her laughter, once faint as wind, now rang clear. Tied to Caleb's belt was the carved bone clasp, the weight of it familiar now, like a second name. The old quilt no longer lay in his room but hung in a place of honor within the tribal lodge, its faded colors preserved beneath cedar smoke and reverence. Where once the hills bristled with tension and steel, a wide trail now wound through the valley, worn smooth by traders, elders, and children walking side by side. The old boundary was no longer a line of fear, but a bridge built by firelight and a boy's stubborn mercy. He had given what little he had, a blanket, a fire, a name. And in return, he had changed the fate of a valley.